slides to the rule.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining us here for this great event, and thanks to the National Press Club for hosting today. I'm Aaron Ament, the president and co-founder of Student Defense. And for those of you who are just joining us for the first time, we're a nonprofit organization working to advance students' rights to educational opportunities and to ensure higher education provides a launching point for economic mobility, which is really the core of what we're here to talk about today. Our esteemed panelists are going to discuss the proposed rules on financial responsibility for institutions of higher education, administrative capability, and gainful employment. And as many of you know, the gainful employment rules are designed to ensure that career college graduates are able to obtain jobs where they are not saddled with debt that they are unable to repay. The proposed regulations also include disclosure and certification requirements that are critical to protecting students, as well as a new eligibility metric referred to as the earnings premium metric, which is designed to ensure that graduates earn more than the average high school completer in their area, essentially ensuring they are better off than before they entered their program. So I'm excited to introduce Catherine Knott, our moderator today, the federal policy reporter for Inside Higher Ed. Our panelists, Jared Bass, who is my former colleague in the Obama administration at the Department of Education, is now Senior Vice President for Education at Center for American Progress. Acting. Janelle Beavers is the Managing Director at Alvarez and Marshall, and previously served for many years at the Department of Justice in civil frauds, and as Vice President for Strategy at Colorado State University until recently. Stephanie Gold joins us from Hogan Lovells, where she is the chair of the higher education practice and has represented colleges and universities for over 20 years, I think, in a wide array of issues, everything from legal and regulatory challenges to general counseling. Dan Zibel is our vice president and chief counsel at Student Defense, one of my co-founders of the organization and a former colleague from the Department of Education's Office of General Counsel, where he was the Deputy Assistant General Counsel for Post-Secondary Education and previously practiced for a number of years in the private sector. So with that, Catherine, I'll kick it off to you.
Okay, can everyone hear me? How fun. Okay, so as Aaron mentioned, there's a lot here in this more than 1,000-page regulatory package. There's changes to financial responsibility, what institutions will have to do to be eligible for federal financial aid or Title IV funds, and so much more. But gainful employment has been, I think, the most high-profile rule in this package. But we can really be here all day talking about this, and I don't know if everyone wants to. I could. But we're just going to dive right in. So Dan, gainful employment has been this years-long saga of proposed rules, lawsuits dating back to 2010. Can you just kind of describe how we got here and what gainful employment is supposed to do, like what a rule?
Sure. So I guess from a sort of 1,000-foot perspective, under the Higher Education Act, there are essentially three types of institutions. There's your public institutions, your private nonprofit institutions, and those that offer a program of study to prepare students for gainful employment in a recognized occupation. That's generally your proprietary institution. There are sort of separate provisions about what programs are eligible to participate in the student aid programs, but gainful employment is the requirement to, what we say is gainful employment, the requirement to prepare students for for gainful employment and recognized occupation. It's something that generally applies to programs at virtually all programs at for-profit colleges and non-degree programs at publics and nonprofits. So I think there is a misconception out there that the gainful employment requirement is a for-profit college thing. It certainly encompasses most for-profit programs, but it is not exclusively there. And a lot of programs at public institutions and private nonprofit institutions are also covered by the gainful employment rule. So it is a statutory term. It's a condition of eligibility to participate in the Title IV programs, that for these covered programs, they have to prepare students for gainful employment in a recognized occupation, which in Congress's infinite wisdom is a very clear term, and we all know exactly what that means. And I think that actually really is the heart of the discussion, which is, the Department of Education has to assess whether or not a program is or is not able to participate in the student aid programs, which requires them to say, do you prepare students? Is this a program of study that prepares students for gainful employment in a recognized occupation or not? And for many, many years, I think it's fair to say it was ad hoc or, not subject to regulation at least. But starting at the beginning of the Obama administration, the Department of Education sort of embarked on what is now this 14-year-long journey of defining the gainful employment provision. So there was, rulemaking happened starting, I guess it started in 2009 or 2010. I don't remember exactly when it began, but a final rule was issued in 2010, basically setting, standards for what it meant to prepare students for gainful employment in a recognized occupation. And the department took the approach really to design it around different metrics, that debt to earnings metrics. So if the debt, if your debt levels, if your student graduate or completer debt levels were too high, commensurate with their earnings, again on a cohort basis, that you were no longer within the meaning of gainful employment. I'm going to sort of shorten this somewhat here, but the rule, and there were disclosure provisions involved as well. The rule was subject to challenge almost immediately from the for-profit college sector. That challenge in 2010 was successful, and the rule was struck down, but it was done so in a really important way, because the court fundamentally faced two questions. One is, did the Department of Education have the authority to define this term at all? And then the separate question of, was their definition reasonable under the Administrative Procedure Act? And the court essentially, as to the first question, said absolutely, this is an ambiguous term, and under something called the Chevron doctrine, Congress gave the department the authority to define this term by regulation, as long as the term is reasonable and as long as they comply with the Administrative Procedure Act. And it was really that second component, which was the department's 2010 rule done with a sufficient basis, that's where the court struck down the rule. So the department has the authority, but it didn't use it correctly. 2014, the department had started the rulemaking process again, and the rule basically redid the process. Metrics were a little bit different, and ultimately the courts, again in challenges to it, said, okay, this time you're good to go. There was some subsequent litigation after that, but in 2019, under Secretary DeVos, the department made the decision to rescind the rule in its entirety and not replace it with anything. I should say, in full disclosure, there is still litigation going on about the rescission, which Student Defense is involved in heavily. And the Biden administration came in.
Yeah, which brings us to today.
Wanted to redo this all. So it really is a 14-year process. This is now the fourth bite at the negotiated rulemaking for gainful employment. But But, you know, I think at a high level, it is about ensuring that these programs, and it's about, you know, this is something that Congress did put into the statute, that programs that are non-degree programs and programs that are offered by for-profit schools do actually prepare students for gainful employment, that there is this notion that these are career programs, and that students should not be getting taxpayer-funded loans and grants to going to schools that don't provide programs that are going to, you know, do what we all think they're, you know, do all think that higher education should be doing, which is providing a leg up and providing that path to a high-paying job, or at least a paying job, and a career.
Fabulous. So that kind of brings us to present day. The comments on this rule closed on Tuesday. So everyone, if you still want to make a comment, you can't. But Stephanie, I mean, you can maybe in a secret way.
Yeah.
But, publicly. Stephanie, what exactly is the department proposing here, and kind of how is that different from the 2014 rule that we saw go into effect for a little bit?
Sure. So under the proposed rule, a gainful employment program would be required to pass 2 measures to demonstrate financial value to maintain eligibility to participate for the program, to participate in Title IV. The first measure is actually 2 tests, debt to earnings rates. So one is called the discretionary debt to earnings rate, and the other is the annual debt to earnings rate. The discretionary debt to earnings rate is the percentage of a program's median annual loan payment compared to the median discretionary earnings of the students who completed the program in the relevant cohort. And the annual DTE rate is the ratio of the program's typical annual loan payment amount to the median annual earnings of the students who completed the program in the relevant cohort. The second measure is called the earnings premium measure. And that measure looks at the amount by which the median annual earnings of students who recently completed the program exceeds the earnings threshold. So what's the earnings threshold? The earnings threshold is the median earnings for working adults aged 25 to 34 who either worked during the year or were unemployed and who had only a high school diploma in the state where the institution is located, or nationally, if fewer than 50% of the students in the program were located in the state where the institution is located. So to pass the DTE rate metrics, a program has to have, under the proposed rule, an annual DTE rate that is less than or equal to 8%, or a discretionary DTE rate that's less than or equal to 20%. And if you fail those tests, then it's considered to be a high debt burden program. And to pass the EP measure, a program would have to have a median annual earnings for students who completed the program that exceeds that earnings threshold that I was describing. And so programs that fail either or both metrics in a single year would be required to provide warnings to students who are, that those programs are at risk of losing their eligibility to participate in the Title IV programs. And then if the program fails the same metric in 2 out of 3 consecutive years, the program would lose eligibility for Title IV. There are a number of ways in which these proposed regs are different from what was in the 2014 version. That EP measure is a new measure. It was not part of the 2014 gainful employment rules. The proposed rule would lower the DTE thresholds compared to 2014. So in 2014, a program was deemed failing only if its annual earnings rate exceeded 12% and its discretionary DTE exceeded 30%. And if the program fell between 8 and 12 for the annual earnings and 20 and 30 for the discretionary earnings test, it was in the zone, was what the term was under the 2014 rules. And so there was some time given to the institution for that program to make adjustments to come into compliance. That concept is eliminated under the proposed rule. The department, again, intends to use debt and cost information for years predating the effective date of the new rule. So this rule, if we assume it goes into effect July 1, 2024, which is how it works under the department's master calendar. If they get the final rule done by November 1, the rates will be measured using data from years before, going back as far as 2017, including the COVID pandemic years. And under the 2014 rule, there had been sort of a transitional period to help institutions kind of adjust to the new rule. That's not part of the proposed rule. There was an opportunity under the 2014 rule for institutions to appeal their rates and to be able to show the department alternative data to demonstrate compliance. That is the opportunity for dialogue with the department about your rates is very circumscribed under the proposed rule. And another, I think just the final significant difference I'll highlight is that under the proposed rule, the department will calculate DTE rates for non-gainful employment programs. So for public institutions and nonprofit institutions that have non-GE programs like their standard degree programs, there will be rates calculated for those programs. And if the rate is a failing rate for a program, the school will need to get an acknowledgement from the student that they're aware that the rate is, it fails the metric. And so there'll be these disclosure obligations around the non-GE programs, but there won't be the loss of Title IV eligibility consequence that attaches to the GE programs.
Yeah, thanks. And just to clarify, there's nothing in the proposed regs that kind of accounts for any pandemic effect on earnings.
No.
I mean, I didn't read that either.
No, yeah.
So if anyone wants to take it, do these changes make it a better rule? Don't all speak at once. Better, worse? Where do you come down?
I mean, I certainly think that they make them better. I think Dan outlined kind of like the long history with gainful employment, and you can actually take the history back even further. Look at the statutory text. It's encompassed in 1965, through the HEA and even the program that covers vocational loans. And so I think if the purpose of higher education, especially career programs, is to provide some sense of economic mobility, I think we do need to look at outcomes. I think we do need to look at earnings, whether they be at the high school level or looking at, relative debt to earnings as well. And so I think, following the history of GE and actually having a rule that should hopefully go in place, be left alone, fingers crossed, does make not only the rule better, but will make, I think, higher education and that economic and social mobility aspect of higher education preserved, especially when it comes to career programs.
Definitely. So, Jared, we'll stick with you for a minute. So the administration is doing a lot more here than gainful employment, as we mentioned. What else is kind of involved that you see, and how does it fit into, how does this set of proposals fit in with the Biden administration's, larger agenda? Why are they important? Try to give us the forest for the trees a little bit.
I want to give you branches. I'm
Just branches. Actually, just the leaves. Thank you. So that's what I want.
So I think in addition to gainful employment, very, very important aspect, we have certification procedures, which are looking at, program participation agreements, basically certifying that, programs meet certain aspects, and then financial responsibility, looking at triggers, or providing more flexibility to look at triggers. And if, institutions, programs are at risk of closing, there's also ability to benefit, which is providing a pathway for people who don't have a high school diploma to show that they have an ability to benefit from a post-secondary education, and then have access to Title IV aid, and then also certification procedures for financial responsibility, GE. I feel like I'm missing one, but maybe that's...
Administrative capability?
I think I talked about it.
Okay.
Yeah,
Like we said, there's a lot.
Yes.
You don't even have notes.
Yeah, I know.
We talk about this a lot at work. I think for the forest aspect, people probably don't want to talk about debt cancellation, especially if we didn't have to with a lack of a Supreme Court decision. But I'm going to talk about it anyway, which is basically to say that I think we've always been a fan of saying, in addition to debt cancellation, we need to look at the underlying causes or root causes of student debt, which are college costs, lack of added funding or funding that keeps pace with inflation for student financial aid programs, but also this accountability issue. And so I think that this package of regulations is focusing on that accountability aspect, looking at the very beginning to make sure that we don't have students who are pursuing a higher education, whether that be through a career-oriented program or through a traditional means, are going into debt that's not going to provide them the return on investment that they otherwise would have had if the federal government stepped in and said, actually, you know what, this program's not going to give you your bang for your buck. It's going to be a low-value program. And so I think that those are the types of regulations and things that going forward we need to have in place to ensure that we don't have a either growing student debt crisis or a student debt crisis again. And so I think that this suite or package of regulations will allow the department more flexibility, students more flexibility and transparency to just know what they're getting into, and also to have information on the front end to say, you know what, I think my dollars and my time would be better spent either not enrolling in higher education or in enrolling in a different type or different set of institutions. So.
Definitely. Stephanie, looks like you want to get in on this.
Yeah, I think with this package, I think there is fundamentally a philosophical debate at play with this regulatory package, because it is implicitly making judgments about sort of the role of higher education, and it is understandably promoting very important policies. Student debt is a crisis, but a question is like, who is responsible for the ultimate sort of structure within which higher ed functions in the United States? And to what extent are universities and colleges responsible for that? And to what extent is the federal government policy writ large responsible for that? And what judgments are going into what it means for, like, what type of job a student may be getting after completion of their educational program? I've heard some say that in a lot of ways this package sort of elevates salary over service. There are jobs that our economy has structured in a way that are low paying. And we may not agree with that. Teachers don't make enough money. And whether there's a connection between like what they had to pay for their undergraduate education and what they're paying for what they decide to do in their career, this is creating just fundamental sort of inherent assumptions about what that ought to be. And these are really important topics. And if it were about disclosure, that might be a way to go. But this is, as a higher ed lawyer, this is about how to help universities and colleges comply. And I find this very anxiety provoking for universities and colleges, because it is empowering the Department of Education to make discretionary judgments without institutions always being able to understand like what exactly the rule is. So I think there is just a big policy debate that's going on with these regulations.
I would add that I also think it's hard when you're talking about, a student who's going to a 4-year liberal arts school getting a degree in art history, or someone who's going to barber school and using a formula that's supposed to.
When the beauty of American higher education is its diversity.
Yeah.
Like, that has been a strength of the U.S. educational system compared to other countries, that there is so much diversity, and this applies sort of these one-size-fits-all sort of concepts.
Go ahead. I was gonna say, I think I appreciate the articulation of like the need for a balance. I think we don't have that balance on the other side right now, which is that institutions are not part of this conversation around student debt, economic mobility, and value. And so I think that this rule is a way to ensure that they are part of this conversation and have been part of this conversation through negotiated rulemaking, where there was representation from various institutional sectors, also providing perspective and detail about the rule. Context matters, and like that's something that the Center for American Progress definitely agrees with, and we mentioned in our comments as well. Looking at childcare sector where there are low wage programs. Yeah. But at the same time, I think that that's why we wanted to go through this regulatory process, is why we wanted to provide feedback and comments to the department, but also to establish that the exception can't become the rule, and that we do need coverage in some way. So I think achieving the balance is still important, but I think it's out of whack on this end. And so I think achieving that balance and going towards institutional regulation is important, while balancing that with transparency and the need for institutions to serve their students well, but also the need for students to be served well as well. But Dan, sorry. I didn't mean to-
No, I was just gonna say, I mean, it seems like a lot of, Stephanie, what you were saying, and Janelle, I mean, to me, it's a lot of why there's a distinction in the law between the programs at public institutions and the programs at, private nonprofit institutions. And like Janelle said, like the barbering programs, where there is, it is education. It is different. It is fundamentally different for a student who's going to get an art history degree from a liberal arts college versus someone, which may not be a highly paying job, at least in the early years, and maybe it becomes that way. I don't know, but the individual who goes to the career-oriented program is probably looking for something different, and I think that, that is, in my mind at least, some of why the language in the statute is what it is.
Yeah, though I think the challenge is that the Higher Ed Act is archaic.
Oh, absolutely.
And that language was written at a time when for-profit institutions were primarily cosmetology schools or schools that were more geared towards occupations. You now have for-profit schools that look a whole lot like a traditional institution down the street in terms of the nature of the programs they're offering. And so you could have a bachelor's of arts in political science at a for-profit school and a bachelor's of arts in political science at a nonprofit school down the street, and it's a different, now the gainful employment rules applying to them differently. So there is that. I think that's the challenge with that provision's been in the law for a long time.
Yeah, and I think to be fair, you also have some nonprofit and public schools
Right.
operating
Yeah,
the other way.
exactly,
Who are operating
right.
like for-profits.
Correct, very
And,
much so, yeah.
The traditional notion that, the incentive, and there is a different incentive structure. There has
Right,
to be a
for sure.
different incentive
Right.
structure that, some of the schools do have fiduciary obligations to be profit maximizers and some don't.
Right.
And, but I think it is, the department has been struggling with this for a while,
Mm-hmm.
and I do think the proposed rule does reflect some of the struggle that you were mentioning. I think one of the other things that jumps out at me is in the proposal, and getting away from gainful for a second, is there are changes that need to be made in the Higher Education Act, and there are changes that need to be made in the department's rules that just sort of like, and financial responsibility jumps out at me as sort of the big one, that what we have is like, the department trying to, engage in this, like, let's predict when a school is in financial distress, because everyone believes that school closures, generally speaking, are bad. We don't want to be in that position. Certainly, they may be good in certain instances, that some schools just need to close. But the predictive aspect of that, I think, is something that jumps out at me in the regulations as something that the department is struggling a lot with, particularly where you have a composite score, which, by and large, I think anyone who is in this world has been complaining about and panning is largely useless for a long time. No matter what end of the spectrum you are on, and the composite score is not working. I think every administration has recognized that, and no one seems to be willing to touch it.
Isn't that what happens when you don't have an HEA reauthorization? How old is
Yeah,
it?
right.
In this
I don't know.
point,
I mean, the
like,
HEA
you know,
gives the department,
2008.
it says, department, come up with some ratios. And those ratios have been there for a long time, and, I don't know if anyone thinks that they work. But they're hard.
I mean, it was interesting you guys were talking about the blending between kind of like for-profits looking a little bit more like the other institution down the street, and, nonprofits and others kind of adapting some tactics. There's some new blending, which, like, isn't that why the department proposed kind of just having a set, like the DE metrics and the earnings premium, and they're just going to report it for everyone? Playing devil's advocate a little bit. I don't know if there's like, because I know there was some conversation in the comments about like applying these two, like basically a set metrics across the board.
Yeah, and it goes a little bit farther than that in the NPRM, because in the proposed certification procedures regulation, the department would have authority to consider DTE rates when deciding whether or not to certify an institution to participate in Title IV, and there doesn't seem to be a distinction, as to institution. There are other sort of outcomes, performance kinds of measures that the department would have authority to do, to look at, and that's one of the examples of where I'm saying, as a lawyer who counsels universities and colleges, it will be very hard to counsel institutions about what the risk is associated with that regulation, because I don't quite understand what the department's going to do. And losing your Title IV eligibility is catastrophic. And probably at the end of the day, not so good for students. Let's just be like, so, for, a lot of the institution students. So there are ways in which it plays out in other parts. I mean, I think the disclosure elements, if done appropriately, may be helpful for students to be able to be educated to understand what the situation is with their program. I worry a little bit that we're like, inundating students with disclosures that I'm not sure they always can fully understand. And this has been sort of going on for a while. I ask students if they read their Cleary Act reports, and most of them don't know what I'm talking about.
I do not believe that. They only read the text that's like,
Exactly, yeah.
there's a creepy guy that's over here.
So, and this is hard stuff for them probably to wrap their, a first generation going to college student, I think, could have a hard time understanding. So, we'll see. I think it's going to have to be done well to be effective.
Janelle, something you want to add?
No, go ahead. I think you were probably about to ask me a question.
Yeah, I think I was actually. So as we come into talking about this conversation, there's just been so much regulatory back and forth over a lot of these rules. Seems like with a new presidential administration, there's new rules. And so what has kind of been the impact of this back and forth and uncertainty for institutions and students?
Yeah, so I think I'll take, I'm really interested in sort of the financial responsibility part of the rule, so I'll use that as an example to talk about how I think institutions are thinking. And I'll say this based on my experience being in an administration on campus, as well as in-house at a large public system. I think, institutions, Stephanie and I were talking about this before the panel, are highly regulated anyway, right? Like there's just a constant barrage of a changing regulatory regime. There's Title IX, there's this, there's all the things. There's nuclear reactors on certain campuses. So it's a very complex environment to be running a university and advising a university in-house and being outside counsel. So I think that in some ways, this is business as usual, right? There's a new regulation, and we need to deal with it and understand the consequences. And I think I think in that way, it's probably a shrug on campuses. Let's roll up our sleeves and try to figure that out. And I think it just as it is, I imagine, very, very hard to write these regulations. It's also very, very hard to read them and understand them. I mean, you heard Stephanie describe what's happening. It is not simple. And I think it's important to recognize that the people, particularly administrators on campus who are learning about this, have other jobs. And in many ways, this is additional work on top of your job, and it also affects different offices, right? Like as Stephanie was talking, I was thinking about all the different spots on campus that these regulations would touch. So provost office, financial aid, career services, and so thinking about how those groups come together to figure out how to comply is something that is on my mind. With the financial responsibility, generally, I think it is something that institutions are already thinking about. It is possible that this will bring it into a sharper relief. You read in the paper all the time about institutions that are having to close or institutions that are merging. I think what I hope actually is that this will bring it into sharper relief, and that institutions will think about their future selves right now, which is a hard exercise, right? That I want to think about today, where I'm going to be financially 3 years from now, 5 years from now, and invest the time and resources to do that exercise. Perhaps this regulation will have people do that because they'll be required to, and maybe that's what the department has in mind. But I think it's a hard exercise, and it's often one that I think institutions aren't necessarily equipped on their own to do, both because of time and resources and just sort of the skill set and what it takes to kind of look at the financial implications down the road. So I think they are. I guess the back and forth. I guess my answer is that institutions are probably shrug about the back and forth, and we'll look to understand it, just like they would all the other with the other
They're just
regulations that affect
Oh,
them.
another set of rules. We'll read and update policies.
Yeah, I mean, the
and-
people in the weeds on it, I'm sure, like, have some anxiety about it, right? So when it's like squarely in the work that you're doing every day, I think that it's something that you're thinking about and hoping that your lawyer, like Stephanie, will be able to explain to you, or your in-house lawyer.
Yeah.
But it is, these things are complicated, and you also don't want to be kind of the guinea pig who got in trouble for the regs, right? Like, you don't want to be that one that's out there leading.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, because we've been talking a little bit more about financial responsibility, is that, in a nutshell, making sure that universities have the financial resources to operate and they don't just like close because they don't have money?
Well, I think it's a little more complicated than that. I think it's operating expenses. It's also exposure. There's a provision in there about whether or not you're subject to a key tam litigation, for example, which could be very expensive. So it's looking at a number of, I think, what the department thinks are data points that show the financial health of an institution, and having to report when you are sort of out of the bounds they've set for those particular data points.
Definitely.
Sorry. And I think the interesting thing here is that like the changes that were made in the regulation are also about like warning signs too. So like, is your institution program at risk of closure? And so I think like context always matters. And so I don't know, this is my hang up, and I appreciate the dialogue, but like I know that there are two institutions, but like I feel like they're different. They may look alike, but fundamentally different. And there's just always a fundamental difference to me between like a public university, a private nonprofit, and a proprietary institution. I just think there's a fundamental difference there. And so I think these regulations are really trying to unpack that and showing what the differences are. And so, I mean, I think the history here is important too, because if you look at, certain problems that we've lived through in the higher education space with certain institutional types, especially in the proprietary space, that's why we have gainful, and just the career problems and career-oriented problems that we've had, and even looking at the veterans experience. And if you look at like all of the closures that we've had in higher education, I think that's why you have this need or this desire on behalf of the department to actually say, how do we prevent the situation from happening again in the future? So I don't think it's that these regulations are coming out of nowhere. They're actually coming out of specific moments in the experience of higher education, that we've experienced over the last decade or so with some of the challenges. And I completely understand that like that is going to mean added scrutiny for some institutions, and like don't downplay that at all. And I'm very happy that capable lawyers such as yourselves are going to be there helping institutions through this. But at the same time, I just feel like we're not forcing institutions to be institutions, that this is not a right, it's a privilege to have access to Title IV, and that should be maintained. Those taxpayer dollars should be maintained. And so I think balance is important, of course, but also downplaying and preventing the risks for students and borrowers should also be central to the conversation.
I'm curious, sort of your thoughts about, because to me this feels like a little bit cyclical, right? So you're in, you have these financial red flags, we'll call them, right, that the department has identified, and so the consequence is not having funding, which feels like, okay, so I don't have the money, or maybe it's that I'm not managing.
Actually, the consequence, I mean, ultimately what the department's trying to get at is, when do we, the Department of Education, need an insurance policy?
Yes, to get our money.
So that we can get our money if this institution closes. And the problem is that sometimes getting that insurance policy creates financial problems for the institution.
That's what I'm getting at. That's a much better way of putting it, Stephanie. Thank you. But yeah, so what do you make of that?
So it's kind of like,
circle in
are
my
you
mind.
causing, closure of an institution or program in some senses by overstepping? I mean, I think that like,
Which might be okay. I'm not saying,
Right, yeah.
You know, Dan, were you
I
going
would say it's certainly an argument that, putting my like prior department hat on, that we heard a lot, which was the moment you take a step towards anything with some institutions, you push the house of cards and the whole thing will just collapse. And then, if the department asks for, a letter of credit, which is fundamentally an insurance policy from the school, that, even the smallest request will cause the school to collapse. And then, the department will get nothing, and it will actually harm the department's financial interests. Which I think is a really complicated question.
It is.
Of
Very
how do
hard.
you protect the taxpayer interest here, which is enormous. I mean, it's an enormous
sure.
amount of
And
money.
what's the role of the department in connection with the school that may be financially struggling?
Right.
And if I'm a 19-year-old attending the school
Right.
or
You have
thinking
no
about
idea
it, like maybe I don't
any of the
enroll
issues.
if I read this, and like it's,
Right.
I think you're right about the house.
At the same time, there's some really common sense stuff in this, in this proposed regulation. If there is you mentioned key TAMs, if there's a fraud case brought by a whistleblower and the United States Department of Justice takes a look at it, which is how False Claims Act case works, and say, we want to intervene in this case. The United States Department of Justice is saying, we think, we're going to allege fraud on behalf of the government. Well, you know what? Maybe the Department of Education, that's a moment where the Department of Education should be thinking about this school a little more carefully.
and state
But
sanctions as well.
Doesn't it also, to push a little bit on that, isn't it also though if like a state sues the institution, that alone is somehow now a trigger?
I believe it
I
is.
think
Which
we've been
is,
there.
it's awfully easy to sue an institution.
I mean, and I think that one is a little different in my mind. But, if the Securities and Exchange Commission delists a stock from a publicly traded institution, the SEC doesn't do that lightly. And I feel like there are
Right.
things in there that are very clear cut to me. There are things we could probably disagree on and debate, but I do think that there's some stuff in here that is incredibly clear, and it's hard to push back on some of it.
I would just say also just the added flexibility that if there are state sanctions, if there is a state investigation, that is a moment the department says, you know what, maybe there's something to pay attention to. Here, I think it's an important moment. I think just given the experience that we had with Dream Center and Argosy and all these examples, and then not being able to recoup any funding in the letter of credit, and then I think borrowing against the letter of credit in some instances as well. I think that happened with Argosy. It is complicated, but I think there also is a rationale. So I don't think that these are irrational, in the sense that they're coming out of nowhere. I think balance again is important and key here in a key key context, but at the same time it's also because of lived experience, and so I think having that flexibility is important.
I mean, from the institutional perspective, is there a way to tackle sort of this idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy and financial closure, when the department is seeing, okay, there's a risk here, and the school is saying, well, the moment you ask us to do something else, that's going to exacerbate that risk. I think this is a huge question that the government has been struggling with.
Yeah, well, and I
And
think.
school, this is not the first conversation.
Right.
Well, yeah, we're not
Yeah,
so
yeah.
original up here.
Right.
I mean, I think.
But no one ever comes up with an answer.
Well, because it's hard. Let's say you're a college president with a decrease in with signs that you don't need the department to tell you, that might not even be on their list, where you are having. I don't think that they
Every
would.
president's focused
Yeah,
on the
exactly.
enrollment cliff that's
And
coming
I
in
don't know that they
2025.
would call themselves financially irresponsible,
Yeah.
but certainly there are red flags that, if you're a good college president, okay, I'm seeing these warning signs. I think to me, if I'm in that chair, I'm thinking, sure, fine, I can report these things to the department per their request, but where, like, what can be set up for me to be successful? Like, is there a way that I'm incentivized to go find a partner? Is there a way that I'm incentivized to, merge or, anything like that, right? Like, so is there another layer of, and I don't know if it's regulation, but is there a creative structure out there to help in the situation, so people can kind of avoid a fire sale?
Because the precipitous closure is really the problem.
And it's
right?
bad for
So if you're-
students.
it's
Like, you do
terrible
not want
for
that. It's
everyone.
terrible for everyone.
And so if there is a way to, but some schools have to close. I
Yeah.
mean, they may not be financially sustainable, or they need to merge, but they need there can be a structured pathway for
Yeah,
that.
that's a good way to
potentially.
put it. A structured
Yeah.
pathway, I
Right.
think, is the answer to your question, Dan. If you want to come up with one of those, that'd be great.
Yeah, which is, I think,
And maybe
challenge.
some institutions would appreciate department facilitate, like it is, when a school is financially struggling and has to merge or has to close, like the stakeholder outrage can be really challenging. I mean, this is particularly in a traditional context. I mean, if anyone's like familiar with what happened with Sweetbriar College locally, like, these are really heart-wrenching emotional situations, and it is very hard to navigate the stakeholder.
And I think it's
aspects
hard
of it.
for the people on campus. Like, you think about, most campuses have faculty who have worked there for years and years. It's the students that have worked there, and so that have gone to school there, and the alums. Like, it's a very, one of the, I think, cool things about higher ed is this complex environment. But this just makes it all the more complex.
and it's also, a residential college is going to be, if it's truly a precipitous closure, a residential college is truly a different situation, right? Where you have people who could find themselves out on the street. I guess, not to sort of bring it back around, but thinking back about what Gainful is sort of designed to do, and it's not truly just sort of an enforcement mechanism, but I think it's about programmatic improvements and making sure that costs are in line with outcomes for students, and that, maybe, I think these things are all interrelated, I guess, and that the debt levels, and people want to go to these schools, people want to and benefit from higher education. But I do think that the gainful component of all of this is often talked about in an enforcement lens, when there's another whole side of it, which is it gives the schools information that they may not have. And I think that is important.
Or that they might not have
Or
compiled.
they might not have, or they may not want to pay attention
Like, I think
to.
they have.
But then that's what the zone did, in some ways, right? Under the 2014 rule, if you were in the zone, you sort of knew you needed to do something to fix your program. There's now, under the proposed rule, not so much opportunity, so it's not, and this is a little bit what's happened in accreditation too. Accreditation used to be about self-improvement, and it's become much more about compliance, and you get penalized if you're not in compliance. So that's kind of the tenor of what's sort of been set up here, I think, in the NPRM, which I just, I think it's important to acknowledge that maybe that's not the right tenor, to your
No,
point.
it is a stricter,
Yeah.
it is a stricter rule in that.
Well, and
in
like
that sense.
with the gainful rule and kind of you're turning back to programmatic, improvement, and just the conversation we're having, from the institution side, does it feel like programmatic improvement when the threat is Title IV? It's kind of like, and I've heard that before, that the departments, it's kind of all or nothing. There's not a lot of steps, because it's all going to lead to you're losing Title IV access, which, as you guys described, is not ideal for institutions. So I guess my question would just be is there a way to have this conversation that's about that brings institutions more in if Title IV eligibility is at stake, or are there other tools the department has that it could be using?
Well, I was going to ask you kind of a similar question, which is, how do you consider how students are educated about this from the outset, right? Like how, like, and what you think from a policy perspective, if that's a useful tool. That's kind of your question, Catherine. Not really,
excellent.
but like
I'm really just the pretty face here, everyone.
But it's kind of a similar question, like what, because I think, you're 18 years old, like should we be giving them the ratios before they enter? Like, what are your thoughts on?
Do you have a week?
I don't, but
I mean, yeah. So I think at the outset, I would just say that I don't think the all or nothing approach is like great. I wish that there was more added flexibility within the HEA to say, you know what, we're going to take away 10% of your Title IV eligibility, or like, put you at 90 or something along those lines. I mean, Dan, it seems like you disagree with that.
Gainful
But
is a programmatic determination at its core, right? So we're not looking at the institution
that's true.
as
But
well in some cases.
so I do think that like providing some, flexibility there, I mean, think would be a great thing for our friends in Congress to consider for the, next reauthorization. Is certainly something that would be beneficial. I think communication is a challenge, because we're struggling with communication, not just for the 18-year-olds, although that's one segment, but like higher education spans the gamut, and so you've got, students going back, it's like dislocated workers, like let me find something else to do. And so I think having information up front is going to be important for them. And I think putting it in context of, finding the right words, right, in a way that is communicated clearly to students is a real challenge. And maybe it's not debt to earnings ratio, or maybe it's not like financial value, but I think when people sign the dotted line, they expect a return on investment. I don't think anyone goes into a program or saying, I'm going to waste a bunch of money and waste my time and like not use this at
no one
all.
does that who doesn't have that much money, right? I think if you have a lot of money and you want to get an extra master's,
Right.
it's like that's not what we're talking about, right?
And so I think for people who are going into this to pursue, they do want to have some benefit. And so I think communicating like, here's the benefit up front. I get that there are intangibles, and I get that there's a social good, public good argument as well. But I think it's not that the age-old question is higher education public or private. Like it's both, right? And so I think communicating that information where students need it is important. How to do that, like that is where research and like something that we're still exploring to figure out how to provide that information. I don't think it's a Clery binder like that's on file, right? And you find out about fire fire suppression. Right? Yeah, I know. That's dating me because I read the fire suppression system information. Yeah. But I do think that providing key information, whether it be through the disclosures that we do provide through advertisement, having like logos, or like just providing more, better entrance counseling, better assistance in high school to say like, hey, by the way, this is part of it. I do think that there's a problem that we have just like in the structure of our educational pipeline where you find out about federal financial aid like when you're right at that moment, right? Like when you're entering college, it would be great if it was more baked into the just learning system, right? And I think some areas have done that with fastest completion and like in order to like Tennessee Promise, for example, where if you were gonna do that program, it's ingrained into the culture, it's ingrained into the educational system, and you have to fill this out. And I think there's like a lot of preparation. But I do think it's a sticky widget, and so I don't pretend to have the silver bullet, but I think that that's certainly something that we need. I just know that the answer isn't like less information, and I think it's just the right information, and how to provide that information is still something that we're exploring.
I'm just thinking, you turn on the TV at night, right, and you watch, name your pharmaceutical product, right, your drug, and like the end of it, there's that half, it's a minute-long ad, and half of it is the disclosures. One of which is like, if you're allergic to this drug, don't take this drug.
You will die.
And it's like, well, that's what, we don't want that either. And I think students do need to know, but it's really, I think, balancing the right information and balancing, the information that is actually going to be useful. And so like providing a student with well, they got a 1.2 on their composite score last year.
Right.
I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
But I think, articulating what that means, right, like is going to be the useful point for students, which is like, maybe a risky investment for you.
They do have, right, when you look at, I think, like U.S. News stats now, they'll have % of students employed at graduation, right? Isn't it on there? Am I dating myself? I feel like I used to be.
Yeah.
Like, I think there's generally like sort of public information about that, but that doesn't say like how much debt you have, how much money you're making or whatever, just whether you had a job at all. And I think that's something that people, you
It also
know.
just gets in, like, I feel like with each of those, there are so many points where at least some institutions have a demonstrated history of fudging those numbers. And we've seen it with employment numbers produced by schools. We've seen it with the US News issues. And I think that is some of what the problem here is that disclosures are only good as the information. And
Well, and what's a
You know,
disclosure
well-
and what's advertising? Those are different things
Those kinds,
too,
yeah.
I think.
I do think that what is reflected in this NPRM too is a judgment by the Department of Education about when it believes a student can actually make an informed decision and when the department's going to make the decision for them. And a really good example of that is with respect to professional licensure programs, because in the proposed rule, it would now be a condition of participation in the Title IV programs that an institution really could not offer a program that leads to professional licensure if the program doesn't satisfy the rules of the state where the student is located for professional licensure. Currently, under the regs, an institution has to provide certain disclosures as to professional licensure and whether they satisfy the state's requirements for professional licensure, or whether, the student ought to figure that out. I struggle to know how institutions are going to manage. I mean, a student can be in state X and plan to move to state Y. We've got 51 jurisdictions state institutions need to think about. I mean, and that is, I think, ultimately maybe not great for access to programs, and particularly professional licensure programs where there's a high need for it, for students. And so I'm not really sure what's going on, what's going on
I
there.
think those are incredibly fair considerations. I think the flip side of that
Yeah.
is schools. Westwood College is a great example of a school that advertised itself as you could become a cop, but the school at the time was nationally accredited, not regionally accredited, and so lo and behold, in the state of Illinois, where Westwood was, you couldn't actually become a cop, but you could be a mall cop, which is not.
But there also weren't the disclosure requirements at that time.
But it also, it led. I think it's endemic of a situation where there are so many examples, and Globe University, I think, was doing a similar thing in Minnesota, where there works, and they're incredibly costly for taxpayers at the end of the day, which gets, again, it ties you back into the financial responsibility considerations, but where you have, these are, multi-billion-dollar mistakes at some point, What do you do with that? And so I think you're right. I mean, you're right. Like, these are complicated questions where you could have, what if a student wants a program to become a cosmetologist in Indiana, and Indiana's rules are different from Illinois, and then they move across, picking on
But
the
this is
states.
not just a but it applies to,
Yeah, no, it
pick
does.
your public institution that's offering, an online,
Yeah, no,
so it's like, yeah.
it is incredibly complicated.
Yeah.
I don't know what you do. I
Yeah.
don't have the answer.
Right.
What if a student enrolls thinking it's all fine and then decides for whatever reason to move to a different state halfway through their program and doesn't even
Right.
dawn on anyone, well, maybe you should be.
Well, there's now requirements that you'd have to make sure they know what the consequences are. I mean, I think, again, it's reflecting a judgment.
Yeah,
It's a judgment
that's
that
right.
the government's now saying, we don't think a student is able to figure this out on their own. So we're going to just decide that program can't participate in Title IV.
I also feel like this comes up in the state authorization context as well, which I think is kind of
Yeah,
the underlying
yeah.
current through all this, with
Yeah.
reciprocity agreements
Totally,
and
yeah.
kind of the setup of NC SARA, or actually SARA, the state authorization and reciprocity agreement, and just maybe more of the restriction on states as well. Of the whole process of state authorization was for states to take an active role. Like, the federal government was begging them, please take an active role in actually, defining what post-secondary education means and the type of institution that's providing post-secondary education. then we have this situation now within this online context, which I'm not saying is bad, it's just, it is what it is, where we're like, states, don't take an active role in the, oversight of, institutions, and like, let's just, so I think providing some, capacity to make sure that students as well as states are aware of like, okay, we have these licensure requirements, the students are coming in, and, again, finding that balance is important here too. And I think that's something that, we're wrestling with, but also, again, love the public comment period, to provide some advice and guidance to the department as they struggle with this, which is a really, really important issue, just making sure states are still at the table.
So, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them. I have one more, and then we can throw it out to y'all for questions. What are one or two things, we already have flagged so many, that you all would want, that you think would have a really big impact on students or institutions that are in this rule but are just not getting as much attention? Because as we've noted, it's 1,000 pages and there's a lot in it. Basically, is there anything you just want to flag that hasn't come up in our conversation today? Which I think we've covered a lot.
I think for me, the pre-enrollment expenditures, aspect of what institutions have to disclose as part of their financial statements is like important. Actually getting a look at how much institutions are spending on like that aspect is, maybe we disagree, but like I don't know that it's just like new and different, and so I think that's exciting.
Yeah, I agree with that one, actually. Yeah.
And it's going to be a footnote.
That's a good one.
It's going to be a footnote in the audited financial statement, right? Is that how they're asking you to report it?
I believe there is a footnote.
Yeah, I think it's a footnote.
Yeah, so look your footnotes in your audited financial
Lots
statements.
of notes.
I mean, to be fair, that is where like 90/10 comes. It's a note.
Yeah.
It is a note to the audited financial
Yeah.
statement, so it's not insane.
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
sort of use that as a.
Composite score too, for that matter, sometimes, yeah.
Anything else y'all wanted to flag?
So one nugget that I came across recently, which I wouldn't necessarily say this is like a high, and I don't know how high impact, but as a higher ed lawyer to universities and colleges, I'm sort of wondering about it, which is as part of the administrative capability rules, there would be this idea that the institution must provide adequate career services. And like very much in keeping with the theme of the NPRM, so I understand it. I understand the reason why the department maybe wanted it. I don't understand how it's going to be applied. And they do include some concepts like, to assess, the department would consider, the number and distribution of career services staff and career and like the presence of institutional partnerships with recruiters and employers. I mean, they have certain elements, but it's a non-exclusive list. So again, as a lawyer who advises universities and colleges, I'm, based on the proposed rule, not entirely sure what this means. And fundamentally, universities and colleges want to comply with the rules. Like,
They also want their students to be employed.
and they want their students to be employed, and they are highly motivated to comply. And like when you have a rule like that, where the department has, even today, like a lot of discretion to say like, oh, you're not administratively capable and we're going to impose all these negative consequences on you. I don't know what this particular one means yet. So it'll just be interesting to see how it plays out.
Well, and also if you're thinking about sort of, you want financial responsibility, but now you need to go hire
Right,
a whole army
yeah,
of career
yeah.
services.
Right, yeah.
There's lots of
And I
involved.
thought this
I
was
mean,
something that
practically.
maybe was really an accreditor role. I mean, I do think so. I practice in the space of the regulatory triad, the U.S. Department of Education, accreditation, state authorization, and you were talking about the role the states were supposed to play. Like, there was an idea originally that I think the department used to refer to it during the Obama years as 3 legs of the stool or whatever. Like, each of those elements of the triad were supposed to have complementary but not necessarily identical roles to play. And I think the department has gotten perhaps a little frustrated that it doesn't think all the legs are doing what they want it to be doing. And so like the dynamic has changed a bit. But then you're starting to see some of these issues show up in the department's realm that I think historically would have been in someone else's realm.
Yeah, that's a good point. Dan, see you paging through
You
the
know, I was
NPRM.
looking for
He has in a
something.
binder.
I was looking for something.
Do
and
you
now
want
I've
to
got
have like
glasses
flags in
on.
mind?
So there's one that was pointed out to me, and I won't, that I didn't flag, and I won't say who. But there's a requirement in here, and again, this is like a nugget,
Yeah.
about full faith and credit. Where public institutions
I know
may
what you-
have to provide documentation.
Yeah.
Because public institutions are, the financial responsibility, generally, if you're a public institution backed by the full faith and credit of your state, you sort of, the statute sort of carves you out of the financial responsibility rules. And the department is modifying, and I couldn't figure out where it was so quickly, the rule such that you now have to provide some level of documentation about that. And I wonder, I can see where that's coming from, and I do wonder whether that will cause some concerns, whether all public institutions, whether it could be weaponized
Yeah.
by certain states that may not want to provide
Yeah.
the full faith and credit backing if schools offer certain types of programs, DEI programs, for example, in today's political climate. Or whether there are states that may not have all their ducks in a row on, whether as a public institution, there's any piece of state, authority or state legislation that says, hey, we do, back our public institutions with the full faith and credit of the state. And whether, if asked for documentation on that, the school may have to just go, yeah, we don't have that.
Is right now it's just assumed that a state would,
I actually don't know. I don't know the answer to
Well,
that.
it also could
I don't know if
impact like
Stephanie-
other litigate, like having that out there, like how does that impact, like you saying that, what does that mean for other things? I don't know, that's interesting.
Yeah.
You know?
so everyone go read it. It's a riveting read. Questions?
Thank you. This was a really informative panel. I have one question relating to just how these data points get calculated, debt to earning and whatnot. When you're talking about a program, what does that mean? Is that a nursing school? Is that or are there separate data for Bachelor of Nursing versus Masters of Nursing? Is there a separate data for a bachelor with a specialty in, emergency room care or neonatal care or elder care? Are all of those individual programs, or is there just one metric for the entire school? How does that break down? And also, I guess, would there be differences for an online program if a school offered both an online and an in-person program? Are there two different numbers that get calculated or one?
So each program gets categorized according to a CIP code, and it's based on a classification system that was used for the prior GE programs as well. So it's at the program level, and it's looking at these CIP codes. I don't know if you can articulate better than I am right now what exactly the CIP code is, but it sort of aligns the program with particular fields and areas. And so like it does get to
It's pretty
it does get
granular.
fairly granular as to a particular program. Now, if you have the same program online and on the ground, there were some different, I don't know what under the current rule that looks like, if they're treated as different programs, because sometimes this gets into some of the weeds of Title IV, like that classification. But that is fun, that's basically how it gets done at the program level.
And this rule is doing it at the 6-digit.
It is the six
The
digit.
6-digit, and if you
which
go-
was, more favorable in terms of granularity than what was also being, than a 4-digit CIP code. That's right, thank you.
If the proposed regs become final as is, from a institutional perspective of a challenge, I guess I'm looking at Chanel and Stephanie here, are there provisions that you think are most vulnerable to a challenge?
Most?
I mean, to a legal challenge?
Yeah.
I'm hesitant
Yeah, I
to
am too.
speculate about.
Oh, I'm and I'm not practicing right now, but I know.
I think there's some questions about process here that I'll flag that I don't think I'm the first person to flag. I mean, I'm not sure how much of this was actually discussed at negotiated rulemaking. It's, I've actually been at this, my first negotiated rulemaking was after the 1998 reauthorization, and it's just not what it used to be. And there may be some process aspects there that I think people have raised questions about, but on the substance, I think I'll plead the fifth.
Yeah, I'm not even practicing, but I'm still gonna put the fifth on that.
Yeah. Well,
Hi. Thank you so much for this informative discussion. I think some important context is how much the higher education system is not serving students right now. Many students, in terms of the unsustainable debt that they're getting, in terms of their expectations of how well they'll be prepared for certain careers, and the way they get information about programs. Often it's on the internet now. The information that they often come across is developed by lead generators, not necessarily all the great information that's being developed by the Department of Education and being officially published. So given that context, do you think that these regulations set an acceptable floor, or are there still holes that need to be addressed, perhaps in other areas, or where else might we be looking to help address some of the problems that students are facing?
Jared or Dan?
I think the regulations and the department's even existing regulations do a lot there. The Department of Education has an immense amount of authority over institutions. And the Higher Education Act gives them immense amount of authority over institutions. And I think some of the problems that we have seen, again, particularly in the for-profit sector over the last 15 years, some of them could have been avoided by stronger regulations. But I do think that some of them could have been avoided within a framework that has existed for a long time. That the Department of Education has not been great at using, which is its own gatekeeping function and its own, sort of police power over misrepresentations by students. I think misrepresentation to students, not by students. That the department has a bunch of tools in its sort of enforcement toolkit that for whatever reason, good, bad, otherwise, it just sort of doesn't seem to want to use with any amount of consistency. The ban on schools making substantial misrepresentations to students. Things like personal liability and entity liability. Personal liability, which does show up in this rule, but it's been something that's been in the Higher Education Act for more than 30 years at this point. And you sort of joked that, like, if the department did it once, boy, would that send a sort of an impact through the market and cause institutions a little bit of concern. But it's been there for 30 years and the department has never actually used it. So I think there is a lot that can be done by the department that doesn't require additional rulemaking. And it's one of the things that I think the department, for whatever reason, feels like it needs to regulate on everything, whereas there are other tools that it can use to sort of improve higher education and the programs. I don't know.
I think for me, and do agree with that. I think it's also just like we were talking about the program integrity triad. I feel like the department, has other cooks in the kitchen, but it's the only one cooking sometimes. And so it's like having to wait tables and do dessert and take orders and then go back and prepare it. And so, I feel like we'd all be better served if the various functions of the program integrity triad were just doing what they were supposed to do as intended. And I think sometimes the department has to step in and say, do this, like, here is your job description, please go do this. And I think sometimes it has to do that through regulation. I do think the one area that is kind of still elusive is just how we control college costs. And I don't know, like, the right mechanism or various mechanisms to actually do that. Like, should states be doing it? Should the department be doing it? Maybe it's all of the above. But do you think that that's like the missing ingredient or missing piece here? I think I'm just hungry too because I didn't get a box of lunch, so everything comes back to food for me right now. But I think that that's an area that still is worth exploration. And I mean, the other thing I would say is just like, let's just have gainful employment. Let's just leave it alone. I think, since 2010, it's just been on again, off again. And I'm tired of writing comments on this. So like, I think let's just leave it in place, see how it goes, and like just have that be what it is. And I think that that's one aspect, of improvement. So I'll leave it there.
Well, cool. I think that's it for me. Any final thoughts from the group?
This was fun.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you. It was great to have this
Thanks, you
conversation.
three. Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Catherine.
Is that a wrap? We're cutting?